Chapter 7. Stretch Your Legs. Summary. When a commotion starts on the ship and the guards are distracted, the group must use this opportunity to try and escape. Quick note for the PODFIC version of this story. In the original, the words that the Terrans don't know yet in BASIC are just underscores. And because I wrote it, I know what word is supposed to be there, and it's pretty easy to guess in most of them anyway. But I'll just be taking that actual word, plugging it in Google Translate and popping it out in a random language and trying to pronounce that. Hopefully it gets kind of the effect across that you don't know the word. It's not you're just mishearing random things. So I hope it works. If it doesn't, let me know. I'll try something else and just go back and re-edit kind of that bit out. It was a long time before anything broke the endless monotony of the trafficking ship. The cruel situation they had found themselves in had become their new normal quicker than they would have liked. Days stretched into weeks, stretched into months, that they were trapped in their cage. Izuku could feel himself getting thinner and weaker, muscles just wasted away with no physical activity, and fat reserves were eaten up until there was nothing left. Izuku's costume now hung loose on his thin frame, the white sections long since dirtied into an ugly brown. No one else was looking much better. Though the humans had been getting extra rations recently, while it filled their empty stomachs and brought back some of their strength, there was only one reason that the traffickers would do this. They were preparing to sell them off. While they knew it was an inevitability if they weren't able to escape, the knowledge that it could happen any cycle now was so much worse. If something didn't change soon, all 6 of them would have to fight and kill to survive. The only bright points in their days were each other and their Osir's neighbors they now called friends. The nights still brought with them the now traditional lullaby sessions. After months, many of the songs began to get repeated enough for the Terrans to learn the words, even with their limited understanding of BASIC and their non-existent understanding of the other languages used. They were still often able to join in when a regular lullaby began. While music filled their nights, their days were still as plain as ever, and with nothing to do but talk, the 2 groups had grown close over the months. They learned that the 2 were, in fact, young, like Izuku had first thought. They were a little behind the teens in their developmental cycles, roughly 9 and 11 in human years. Pyurpo was male and the younger of the 2. Fastel was 11, verging on 12 the next lunar cycle. Pyurpo was very creative, coming up with many stories to tell the group. They didn't always make sense, but the teens were happy to listen to the kid's tales. His optimistic nature kind of reminded Izuku of a younger version of himself. Fastel, on the other hand, was very much the protective older sibling stereotype. As more time passed, they learned that it was in part due to their love of kids. They always enjoyed looking after the younger ones in the community whenever a caretaker needed help. The 2 siblings had been taken away from their home planet of hiatus, away from their community and everyone they knew, just like the teens. Izuku felt a cold fury just thinking about it. Thankfully, the Oisirs had only been there for a few days before the humans arrived, so they had not been trapped too much longer than them. The information that the 2 aliens were younger seemed to trigger some protective instinct in the rest of the teens. They immediately decided amongst themselves that there was no way they would leave them behind if they had the opportunity to escape. They would not leave these literal children in a cage. When the humans expressed this sentiment, the Oisirs had surprisingly asked if they were a pack-bonding species. Izuku wasn't quite sure what this meant, but the siblings seemed convinced. So they passed the time together. While the teens grew closer to the siblings through their limited vocabulary, they became even closer with each other. They knew that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. Turns out trauma really makes a good bonding experience. The thing that broke the cycle of endless days was a blaring alarm. The humans hissed when it started, reaching up to cover their ears. What happening? Izuku inquired to the two sentients, wincing in pain at the piercing alarm as it continued to blare. Broken Basic, getting the message across. We're not sure. It could be some rendit of attack, Fastel replied quickly, moving closer to the teens. We maybe escape? Mina tried, grasping her limited knowledge of the language. Izuku didn't know what more they could do now that the ship was having some sort of emergency, until he felt a telltale prickle rising under his skin, the sign that the quirk suppressants were wearing off. The traffickers always seem to let the teens get to the point where they can almost feel their quirks surfacing before dosing them again. It was always so crushing to have their power just out of reach before being snatched away again. It was probably some sort of cost-saving measure, but it might just come to bite them in the butt. If their captors were too distracted by the emergency, then they could break out and take an escape pod. According to the siblings, they were standard on all large ships. All the kids could do was hope that these traffickers adhered to galactic safety standards. So they waited. As the alarm continued to blare in the background, the staticky feeling grew and grew under the kids' skin. Time seemed to creep by all too slow as they waited to see if the guards would come in for their next dose. If they did come back, Izuku didn't know how much more he could take of being stuck in their cage. But it appeared no one was arriving anytime soon. A nervous energy ran through the group. They might actually be able to get out, to be saved from the horrible fate that awaited them at the end of their travel on the trafficker ship. But Izuku had another thought eating away at the back of his mind. It was something he considered many times throughout their captivity. With his loss of muscle mass, Izuku might not be able to use One for All. If that was the case, he's sure he'll eventually be able to, but it took him 10 months of training to barely be able to handle the power being passed to him. This time, he would be starting from an even weaker point. So, as they waited for the quirk suppressants to finally leave their bodies for the first time in months, Izuku's worry gnawed at him. The eventual fate of the drugs was signified by the crackling pops that lit up from Katsuki's hands. A murderous smile crossed his face as the feeling of his quirk returned. Soon after Bakugo regained his quirk, Mina began to produce a puddle of acid in her hands. She quickly shuffled over to the bars of their cage and pressed her dripping palms against them. The metal was quickly eaten away enough that a few rams of her shoulder was enough to send the metal bars clattering to the floor. An overwhelming feeling of relief washed over Izuku. He could feel the rising pressure of tears budding behind his eyes, but he pushed them back for now. It wasn't over yet. The rest of the teens quickly piled out of the cage. Izuku fell into a heap on the floor when he tried to walk on his shaky legs. When he tried to stand again, he felt like a baby deer trying to walk for the first time. Izuku had never felt this weak before. It was a long departure from fighting villains back on Earth. He hadn't realized how much he had lost by just being stuck in that cage for so long. Just how helpless they'd all become. He could see Mina barely holding herself up, still using the intact cage bars as she shuffled over to their friends. They probably wouldn't have even been able to walk enough to escape a few weeks ago, but the recent increase in rations had been helping build up their energy levels. So hopefully, that was enough. Holding her hands against the bars, Mina quickly melted them down to nothing. Pyropa immediately took the hand that was offered him and stumbled out of the cage. He seemed much more sure on his feet than the Terrans, and nervously moved to help steady Denki, who was struggling the most. Fastel quickly followed and helped support Mina, before starting to shuffle towards the next cage full of sentience. Despite how every step sapped what little energy they had, Izuku didn't want to leave anyone behind. But before they could get far, the familiar hiss of the room's doors being opened cut through the warehouse. The group froze. but only for a second. Instincts kicking in, Bakugo waved the group behind a cage of a non-sentient gorilla-like creature. They hid behind the beast as they watched a pair of frantic guards rush into the room. The reptilians rushed off, thankfully, towards the other side of the warehouse. Moving as a group, the teens made the difficult decision to head to the doors. Who knew if more guards would arrive any second? Zuko's heart ached to help all those still left in their cages, but his weak body continued to protest even the smallest of movements. He didn't even dare to attempt to call One for All to quell his gnawing dread. He was just too exhausted. So the group slowly snuck their way into the hull of the ship, leaving everyone else behind.